Hey everybody, and welcome back to Funtopia, scenario number 26 in our series, and we have to get 1,400 guests by the end of October year 3. Last go around, we pretty much built out the park in terms of major coasters. However, we are going to fill in the rest of the gaps here and get ourselves the rest of the way to the win, and part of that's going to involve some rework here of some pathways so that we can fit in a splash boats ride. And this was something I had in mind kind of from the very beginning before I even got into the build, is I wanted to put one of these types of rides in, because it's a new type of ride within the Corkscrew Follies expansion pack, and also just because I thought it could be fairly interesting. And what I wanted to do was have more of a sort of meandering section, kind of almost like the river rafts that we got. I think that was not until RCT 2, but have a bit of more of a meandering section and then only a small drop. I think the challenge with these rides in the game is that you've got this huge lattice structure and they can do pretty big drops, but when you do a fairly large element with them, you end up with this giant structure that kind of looks ugly and just really isn't befitting of a nicely themed park, I suppose, or just any kind of a nicely looking park. So we're going to do a smaller drop. Initially I was going to go with something a little bit larger like this, but in the end I settled for just this little guy, and I think that's okay. It doesn't really affect us in terms of throughput and stats and things like that. It certainly is still going to be a very popular ride, but this allows us to do a bit of a smaller thing, and that's going to let us hide the lattice supports, and in this instance I'm hiding it by putting it in a giant box. And this is very much akin to what Andrew from Mickey Man's RCT station did when he did his build through a Funtopia, which I would totally recommend you check out. But what I wanted to do was put it in sort of a show building back here, and we're going to do some kind of simple theming on it here a little bit later. But for now, we can basically hide the thing in a box, and we have a little bit of a crossing there over top of the splash. And, who knows, maybe we could time that so you could be going over there kind of nice and easy when you get the splash there at the end. But I think it works as a decent option here for the ride. One of the things that we could consider is doing this sort of in the reverse, where you have the meandering section at the beginning and then your drop towards the end, because generally you want the thrilling bit to be at the end. It's kind of why I don't typically like coasters that have a lift hill at the end, because it's sort of anticlimactic. You go through the exciting bits, and sure, it gets started right away and gets exciting and all of that, but at the end, you got to wait and go up this kind of slow lift hill, and then you're off of the ride. So in general, I like to do more of the thrilling bits at the end, or the most thrilling bit at the end, so then you kind of get off on that high. But at the same time, you do have this sort of ability now where the guests go down this big drop, they're all excited, they're kind of happy and having a good time, and then all the guests that are on the pathways around them get to see that reaction kind of all the way through to the end of the attraction. So just some kind of considerations when you're building rides about how you want to treat the layout in particular. What I did want to do here is try and raise as much of the land around this as possible. We're not going to be able to sort of cleanly do this, I suppose. So we're going to have some vertical faces that I don't necessarily love, but at the same time, it will let us do a little bit of work here. We're going to actually drop down all of the sections underneath of the ride, because I want to fill it with water. I don't want this to just be the ride trough itself. I do want this to kind of be a larger bit there. We lost a guest just then, but we'll send their family a gift basket. It'll be just fine. But we will fill this whole thing with water and kind of landscape the sides here just a bit to make it feel slightly more intertwined with the rest of everything. And some of these fences and stuff can help out with that. Nicely settled here with the pathways on the edges, so you kind of get that great interaction between the guest path and the ride itself. Potentially going right over the top of this turnaround was not necessarily the best spot for the pathway, but I guess I didn't really have a better option at the moment, so that's what we did, and kind of ended up getting stuck with it here. We built ourselves into a little bit of a corner in terms of just trying to get a smart path layout here, but we'll work through that. I think it'll be okay. And then I wanted to start to bring in a little bit of the whole vineyards thing that we were doing earlier in the last episode, where we got sort of these rows of either hedges or fences, and then we have some plants and things. So that's kind of what I'm doing here, just to give it a little bit of that visual similarity, but changing up the pathway, or not the pathway, but the landscape types and the fence types, just to give it a little bit of variety there. I probably could have put a little more effort into making that look a little bit nicer, perhaps, but in the end, I think it worked out fairly well. I'm going to drop this topspin back in. I had put it in there initially and then removed it, but I thought it fit fairly nicely into this spot here where you have your drop and then goes into the tunnel underneath, and this topspin gives a good view for the riders on that, for the riders on the splash boat. So it's kind of this ride-to-ride interaction, which is kind of fun. And it really is about the only thing that we can fit back here, just in terms of a smaller flat ride. So I think it works fairly okay. So we'll get our pathway in here. The problem is we have this sort of dead-end path on this side, and we want to connect them. So I'm going to lower a section here just to see if we can scooch a little path underneath of this whole thing and get ourselves a loop right here. I will first put in the water just because I wanted to have that as part of the whole thing too, and do a little bit of a landscape adjustment here. But this will allow us to dip down our path, give us a little more space for the guests as well. That's one thing to consider in terms of pathway, because typically you want to go for a simplified path layout if you can, just because it makes a lot more sense. But at the same time, you want to make sure there's enough path that as you get increased guest numbers, that you have a place to put them. So you can't count necessarily on just ride queues to hold all of the guests, and you don't want your pathways to get too crowded. So it's a good thing to think about in terms of having some of these extra loops of path and places for those guests to spread themselves out a little bit. We added a viewing area there and some benches, and really just trying to maximize the amount of space that the guests can go to still see this ride and interact with it, and it just feels a little bit nicer when you have all of that kind of working together with everything. We'll go in here and we'll add a little bit more of these fences just to really sort of clean up the overall look of the space. And I think it adds to the greenery here when we add those hedges as well. I like those hedges, or the conifer hedge, just because I think it looks really nice. It's got that sort of thickness to it in terms of it's a solid fence, so you have a little bit more of the color that is involved, and then it just kind of really fills out your park fairly well. You just need to keep in mind that most likely the guests can't see over top of that because it's about as high as the guests are themselves, so you have to think about sight lines as well, as in you don't want to totally block a visual with a solid fence like the wood fence or the hedges. So just something to consider as you go through the whole thing. So here we're trying to build out this space a little bit more. I went in and did some plaza work. I changed the pathway texture there to the tile, which we're actually going to change back a little bit later just because I didn't feel like the tile was really cutting it for our sort of vineyard-esque feel to this thing. But before we get to that, we're going to get to our last coaster here, which is a bit of a squeeze, actually. We're going to spend a fair bit of time trying to actually just fit this thing in here, but there was a request to do another coaster, and I felt like we had to do one anyway just for the scenario goal. But what I wanted to do was put in a B&M Junior inverted coaster, which are becoming slightly more common these days. The Happy Valley chain in China added two of these a number of years ago, and then Busch and SeaWorld added in some of these as well. So now we've got a few of them hanging around and have a decent idea of the sort of general vibe of these things. The first two at Happy Valley were actually copies of the Vekoma layout, or not copies, but similar in terms of layout path. So we're going to do something kind of sort of similar to that, where we've got this nice little curving drop, and then we have a bit of a figure eight with a helix finale, and go into our brakes here. We are going to provide enough brakes that we can do a second train, so that'll keep our capacity up. But really right now it's just trying to figure out how to even get it into the space, because we don't have a lot of area to work with here, but we're going to try and fit it where we can. And part of that is trying to figure out how to get a helix underneath of our first drop, just to extend the ride layout a little bit, because I felt like it was maybe too short to have this drop, this figure eight, and then go straight into the brakes. It just didn't feel substantial enough, even for a family coaster, to really get to that point. So we're going to play around here a little bit to get that to work. And this is why I build in pause mode here, just because we're really just trying to play around to get the optimal layout in terms of just functionality. And I don't really think this is hurting gameplay in any way. Nobody, I don't think, cares that we're going to take a little bit of extra time here to make this look as good as we can. It's not like we're gaining guests or anything. We have the trade-off too of we're not making money while we're paused, so something to consider as well. I briefly considered trying to relocate and move around the turnaround for the stand-up coaster there at the end, but in the end I thought that kind of made sense where it was. And if you look at the tiles that we've got here, we've got basically 6 tiles from the first free one next to the stand-up right to our park boundary, which means that's a helix right there. So that's a 6x6 helix. So trying to figure out how that might fit exactly. And here's kind of where we started to zero in on what that might look like. And we can kind of squeeze it in there very nicely underneath of the drop. And I think it nests quite nicely in there too. I always say if you can do that sort of ride to ride itself interaction, I think that works very well. Interaction is our word of the day, as it seems, but I think this works fairly well here. And you can see I went with the banked into unbanked kind of S-bend with the larger curves, and I think that's generally okay, especially on lower speeds, wooden coasters, and other elements like Intamin Blitz coasters, like on Cheetah Hunt, for example, or on the turnaround where you have that sort of slalom section through the canyon. It represents very nicely when you do this sort of banked into unbanked, maybe back into banked, to do that sort of left, right, left type combination. And I think it looks pretty okay in the game. And if you're worried about stats, it's not really a thing either, just because those wider corners can take a pretty good speed and not really have any issues with it. But, as we say many a time, we don't really care about the stats. It's just a necessary evil that we have to deal with here. We're going to make it look good before we really care about what exactly it's going to rank in terms of intensity and nausea and that sort of thing. So, now that we are done with our coasters, now it's time to figure out how to get the pathway in. And I really don't pay a whole lot of attention to this unless there's a specific interaction element that I want to consider, but generally, I'm going to build the ride like I want to build the ride, and then after that, I will figure out how to get the pathway through it. And in this instance, we're doing a little bit of lowering of the landscape, A, to bring it down closer to where that helix ends, so it's not totally in a giant pit, and B, it just gives us a little bit of clearance to the stand-up coaster above and lets us do a bit of extra here in terms of a plaza underneath and our exit and our entrance for this ride. So now we can build off of this plaza specifically and kind of work our way through here. You'll note that little piece of snow texture that I have on the upper right corner, and that's really just a marker for me when I was building to know that was the section that I had to line up to in order to get the brake run to line up. So I kind of recommend doing this too when you're building, because I always will start with usually an element mid-ride or something and then kind of work our way backwards. But once you get to the station, I will almost always try and put in a brake run, or at least a section of a brake run, before I get through the rest of the ride. And typically you want to get this to line up as best as you can, and I don't want an S-bend. I don't want to have really weird awkward corners like one small and one large or something like that. So in general, I want to do as best as I can to get the ride layout itself to make the thing line up. So one of the easy ways to do that is just to put a marker where you want the thing to end up, so then you know what you're shooting for as you're building the layout itself. So the nice thing about one of these turnarounds is that we can put rides in the middle of it, and notably the tower rides are really good for that. So we're going to put this S&S shot tower here. We do already have the drop tower on the other side from Intamin, and the observation tower on the far side of the park, but unfortunately, the limited amount of rides that we have with, non-custom things, non-hacked things, all of that, is these parks kind of almost require that you have one of each to make it work. So you get a little bit repetitive here, and it sort of ends in a strange situation where you don't see too many parks out there that have an Intamin gyro drop and an S&S shot tower, for example. But unfortunately, the game sort of dictates that just with the limited amount of stuff that we've got to work with. So take it with a grain of salt in terms of our attraction mix here. We could maybe do a little bit better job perhaps if we had more options. But now we can take this little section underneath of the brake run for the stand-up coaster and build in a car ride. Now, this is one of those things in the scenarios where I've been doing it a little bit more of the, I guess, a little bit less realistic, just in terms of balancing the overall game with the realism and everything. Like, certainly in real life, this coaster would have a big transfer track and a maintenance shed that has 2 or 3 tracks in it and everything else, and that would take up a fair bit of the space. But the thing is, we aren't really going to that level of detail on these playthroughs, just because we're kind of balancing that functionality and in-game abilities and what you can and can't do. So while you could do it and you could visually do it, I just think it kind of gets away from that sort of vanilla game that we're trying to go with here. So I've generally avoided thus far doing something like that. I think in general this is a good balance. I know we've introduced the new ride elements here in recent streams, but I think that's okay too. It still kind of has the general vibe of the space and works fairly well. So, got our car ride here. I felt like vintage makes sense since we're kind of going for this older school winery feel to the whole thing with the Grapevine name. So, we'll go ahead too and bring in some of those rows of hedges just to kind of, I don't know, I guess lead to that winery kind of feel to the space. Maybe if I did this one again, I'd do a little more of the smaller land type buildings just to give a bit more of that vibe, but I don't know. I think it turned out okay in general, but certainly let me know what you think. I've generally avoided doing more of the building structures with the land, which is a very RCT1 technique in terms of theming and stuff. But, who knows? As we get a little further on in our series, we may introduce a little bit more of that. So as we continue on here, we are in August of year 3, so we're starting to do the advertisements to really get our guest count over what we needed to do, and I'm also adding some more rides to get our soft guest gap up, including the double inverter ships, which is sort of a trope, I guess, now in a lot of our playthroughs, but that's a good way to deal with those and build up the guests coming through the gate, even if I don't necessarily like having them back-to-back like that, but it is a good solution for that type of ride, I suppose. Now we're going to do a little bit of work here in terms of our rapids, because we kind of let this thing just sit here unthemed for a while, and I wouldn't necessarily say we're going to theme it, but we are going to do some landscaping to it to clean it up a little bit. First, I do want to go through and add in some of our pathway changes here. I mentioned earlier getting away from that tile path, and I feel like the cobblestone has a much better rustic look to it. And I don't know, when I think of winery, I think rustic more typically. So I wanted to go for that feel and change that up a little bit. I'm going to replace this scrambler once more and kind of rework this whole thing just to give ourselves a little bit more plaza space here to work with and kind of place this a little bit differently. I'm actually going to move the exit here to the backside of it and connect in both that exit and the 2 swinging inverter ship exits, so now they have a very nice kind of back exit pathway there that just doesn't interfere with the front here, so we have more space to work with and play around with. I'm going to build a slightly oblong plaza here, I guess, and this lets us do just something a little bit different. They don't all have to be squares or rectangles, so we'll do this and add in similar details to what we did elsewhere with our planters there with the flowers and also some of these fruit trees that we keep bringing around. I do think the fruit trees tend to be a little bit underrated in RCT. I really like to use these, and especially in custom scenery when you can recolor the fruit on there. These work great if you turn them into like a pink color or a purple color, like plums or something like that. It just has a very nice look to the whole thing. Now we're finally getting to the kind of nice to have section of the build where we now have the money to do the things that we kind of wanted to do at the beginning, but we needed to spend on rides and getting guests through the door. So one of those things was a little pond here at the front where we wanted to have a bit of a walkway at the carousel there that looks over the water, and also our swinging ship that kind of sticks out into the water just a little bit. Similar design to how we've done a lot of these, where we're going to do the rocks and a little bit of the dirt and grass to make this whole thing fit in and blend very nicely. But this lets us just set the scene a little bit as guests come into the park and have the water, have the plants, just make it feel a little more cozy perhaps. And in general, I really try and consider that as usage for water. I just feel like water in general is really, really nice to have in a park and always makes it look better. Certainly not too much water, like Barony Bridge, for example, but in this instance where you have just nice little ponds or rivers or things like that, it really does help elevate your ride and your attraction just to feel a little bit more connected to nature, I suppose. But it just looks nice in the end is really what it comes down to. So that's what we're going to do, and I think it actually works really, really well here. Now we can go back through and clean up some of these in-between bits and pieces, and part of that is just a lot of bush spam here. So you kind of have two types of landscaping. You've got your manicured sections there, like around the plazas and things. Then you have your more, what you would consider, I guess, wild landscaping, which has the bushes and has the bulrushes and the weeping willow trees and things like that that maybe aren't necessarily dealt with on a day-to-day by the landscaping team. So we're going to kind of have a mix of those sorts of things as we go through these park builds. And you've seen that all throughout the previous builds that we've done too. Typically, by the pathway, you're going to see more manicured, and outside of the pathways, you're not going to see that quite as much because you can't maintain all of it in a very, very nice way. There's our win. So that was a pretty easy win in the end. We exceeded the goal by a little ways here at 1,700. Certainly advertising makes a big help of that, and why not? Might as well use it. But here we are in the process of theming up this rapids ride just a little bit, so introducing some of those landscape textures and the rocks and things like that. Looking at that stop train, I should have definitely reassessed the wait times in the station so we didn't have the block stop there on top of the lift, but I guess I must have gotten a little bit lazy perhaps. So we are going to bring in the trees that are on the outside of the map just to make sure, or outside of the park, I suppose, just to make sure that they fit in general and it kind of blends across the whole thing. But we are going to introduce new trees as well. Like we had a couple of those things in there, the weeping willow and the one with the kind of grayish trunk there, just because I feel like variety is good. And in general, from a tree standpoint, you often want up to 6 or 7 different trees to mix into a forest to really make it feel more natural and feel like it's a kind of critical max worth of trees into a space. So that's what we're considering at the moment. I'm going to go through and recolor some of these things because we just kind of plonked them down. Honestly, these scenarios still kind of like we did with Thunder Rock, where we built the thing twice effectively. One to get the win and second to make it look good. That's kind of what we're doing in a smaller way here, and we'll probably end up continuing to do in a lot of these scenarios moving forward, is we got to get the win. So part of that is just getting the build in, getting coasters in, getting the guests through the door. Once you win, it's all out the window. It doesn't really care what our guests are doing at that point, as long as we get the money to play with. So that allows us to do a little bit of extra work here in terms of just cleaning up the things that we maybe wanted to clean up before, but we didn't have the space to do so or the time to do so. And it just really lets us sort of polish it off. So I've kind of seen these videos as I've been recording them deal with part 1 being just building, getting the coasters in, getting the layouts done, getting kind of the main structures in place on the map, and then video 2 has kind of become the clean it up and fix it up a little bit and try and make it look good in kind of a full park build out standpoint. This is a little different too than we did at the very beginning of our playthroughs, like on Evergreen Gardens, where we had a lot of leftover area that we just really didn't touch. And we could have probably spent another couple of streams, I would think, going through and cleaning that up even further. But in the end, just decided to do it in a single video. And that, I think, worked out, but it wouldn't be too much of a bad idea perhaps to revisit that a little bit later and fully build out the park so it looks complete. And I think that's always sort of fun to go back through and look at that. I've thought in general about revisiting a number of our previous scenarios, and this is thinking very much into the future in terms of once we finish going through the series. But there's certainly some that I would like to do again, do a little bit differently, or just take another stab at it in a different style, perhaps. So, all things to think about. But what we're doing right now is really going through and cleaning up the landscape, so our textures and everything. This area underneath the coaster, I'm going to make more of this kind of sandy, gravelly texture, just because you don't really need to maintain grass underneath of there, and I think it looks nice because it gives you a little bit of contrast between the greenery and the rest. So that I think works fairly well underneath of rides, for example. Also going back through here and adding in that mesh fence, which kind of acts as our ride restricted fence in some areas. So typically you want a ride restricted fence if the ride is kind of within 10 or 12 feet of the ground, just from a best practices standpoint. I mean, certainly parks have their various standards and things, but that's a good rule of thumb there, I guess, in terms of how close you want it to be before you want to throw some fencing around it, because you certainly don't want guests trying to shimmy up any of the poles and get to the section where they can get struck by the ride or something like that. Did a quick adjustment here to the pathway because I realized you can put the pathway right underneath of this coaster without actually getting rid of the supports. So you still have the visual, which we always like, and that lets us put in some of these flowers, which helps us on our overall look and feel of the whole thing. And I can also get back through here now that we have some additional time for research, and we can research more of our shops and stalls and things like that. So this gets us a couple of more things of variety for food and beverage options, and that lets us add in some of those because we kind of neglected that in general as we go through here. But squeezing in some trees where we can. We don't want to go too heavily around the rides, and certainly you don't want a tree underneath a ride, no matter how tall it is. You don't want a tree right underneath of a coaster because that's just in the ride path and is something you will always have to watch, that it doesn't grow into the ride path. So in general, try and avoid those. I also try in general and avoid trees right over top of tunnels because your root system and everything is going to grow down, and with a tunnel it's got nowhere to go. So trying to avoid that where we can. And now we're going to finally deal with this giant box, and it has been kind of a thorn in my side through the entire stream as to how I wanted to deal with this thing and make it look less like a giant box. And part of that could be just hiding it with trees in the front and leaving it as is. I looked here maybe about doing some silos or some other things kind of towards our farm or winery type look and feel. Also looked at seeing if we could stack some barrels here, which does, I realize, use the shift key, which we've been generally kind of avoiding, but we're not opposed to it by any means. But it didn't quite look the same. So what I wanted to do was stick with this wood wall and the sort of tan tile, kind of has more of an Italian feel to it, Spanish feel maybe, and we'll go with that. And what I wanted to do was sort of obscure the front of this a little bit to make it feel a little less tall. So part of that is raising the land so it just physically isn't quite as tall, and part of that here is going to be building up a little bit of interaction here with this whole thing. Since we don't have windows, we don't have doors, and we can certainly do that with a little bit of additional stuff like using the ghost train, for example, and creating some space. But what I wanted to do here is make this look a bit like a loading dock, for example, and maybe our wine barrels or something are stored in here. We can also sink some food and beverage options. So we're going to do that here too. So now we have a use for the building beyond just the ride. And we can hide those in there. It kind of looks like a kiosk, for example. We can dump a whole bunch of these barrels around the whole space and clean it up like that. And it just lets us give this building a bit more purpose, and it gives us purpose to the pathway as well. So that's one fun feature that we can do here. Add in some of the wood fencing too, just to give it a bit more of a themed vibe, and more of these barrels. And then what I wanted to do too was also obscure the structure in general, because right now it's very much just a giant box. So we're going to put in some of these little pathways that just go inside that we can put a couple of benches into, and then I'm going to do this bit of a tower element in a couple of spots here. Also raise up the corners here so that we can lower this backside and make the whole thing sort of a parapet wall situation. And then our main roof structure underneath or behind it. Bit of fencing on top as well. I did try and see if I could get some pathways up top and make it look a little bit more like a windows or I don't know, loading hatches or something. I don't really know, but I feel like this is a good way to obscure it a little bit and simplify the forms, for example, and just make it a little more interesting in general. I think we more or less succeeded in that, but we're not quite done because I wanted to get rid of that restroom right there. And I'm going to raise this section of land and kind of create a building extension, I suppose. So if we raise this whole section here, we can connect it up to the building here. Again, adding a little more, I said simplification of forms earlier, but I guess in this instance it's complexity of forms, where we're trying to add a little bit more geometry to the building, so it's not just a rectangle or a square. And then finally, we are going to connect in some of this theming with these vineyard rows into our pathway here as well. I'm going to turn this section of pathway into dirt as well, just because it feels like you're kind of maybe out in the fields walking through it. So now we've got a little bit of variety there, a little bit of nuance to our pathways as well. But that's pretty much it. So we are going to finish up with a couple of landscape elements and fences and just clean up the last little bits and pieces here. But let's jump over to our real-time portion. We'll take a review of the park, and then we'll look at some before and after for everything. So let's jump on over. Alright, here is our finished Funtopia Park. I think we did a fairly nice job filling the whole thing out. Make it feel fairly balanced, too. It's not too dense in any one particular area, but it is pretty dense in general. But I think in order to get our 1,400 guests, we really needed to do that. So let's hop in and take a look at our park. We did rename the park, by the way, to the Chateau d'Académie, which was one of the redemptions on Twitch, so I enjoyed that one for sure. And if you want to rename any rides or the park, you can join us on twitch.tv/Amusement Academy. But our park has a couple different coasters. Our first one here being our Boomerang here, which we renamed to La Via Volta, referencing some of the old classics at Wallaby. But now we have it over on this side where we relocated it from where it started here and made it look a little more realistic as well in terms of layout and everything. Could have maybe used the one extra piece here just so it doesn't come quite to the end, but I think it works all right. Our carousel here at the front, and from a sightline standpoint, it is lined up right as you come into the park, and then you jog to the side here, and then you're lined up very nicely here across the bridge and the plaza itself, which I think works fairly nicely. Our pedal monorail here does quite nice over top of the ride itself. Good interaction there. Same with the observation tower and our little haunted mansion here in the corner, kind of doing its own thing. On the other side, you've got our reflecting pond here with the swinging ship and the double inverter ships on this side. I realize that sort of looks a little bit stupid there, having the inverter ships right next to the regular ship, but it is what it is. I think we'll be all right. Scrambler next door as well, and then our Rapids ride here. This is probably my only complaint about the park, or one of my major complaints, I guess, is that I feel like maybe we could have done this a little bit differently. This is a very old school RCT way of doing a Rapids, where you kind of go up and then go down curve, down curve, down curve, and then splash down at the end. There's a lot more realistic ways to just do this and make it maybe look a little bit nicer, and perhaps we could have, I don't know, did a little bit more water perhaps and squeezed in some extra elements here. But I do like the way it works around the stand-up coaster and some of the interaction that we have here. And this little viewing area seems like it would be kind of a fun one to go chill out right there at the bottom of this drop for the coaster too. So let's cross at our only bridge, and we did keep the one bridge, and that was kind of sort of on purpose. Kentucky Kingdom, which is what this map was based off of, has just the single bridge, and I feel like it worked fairly fine. We didn't have any wayfinding issues by any means. We could have added additional stuff, but in the end, didn't want to do that. And by the way, we still have the road hazards here of our support columns right there in the middle of it, so maybe not the safest, perhaps, but you know what? That's on the drivers of RCT World here. Hopefully they don't run into our coaster, but we'll see how it goes. So, we have our shuttle loop right here that is right along the road, similar to how Kentucky Kingdom had theirs, and I thought it worked fairly well. This was the Wine Whirly, as it was renamed to. We come down to the side, and the big anchor attraction on this side is this splash boats, which has our indoor section over here, has a little drop, and then has the tunnel underneath the topspin, and wraps around with this sort of nice meandering little area in a trench, I suppose. And I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out. It worked fairly close to how I had it in my head. I think what I would maybe do again is relocate this pathway to go around the outside of this thing, so then we have this nice turnaround here fully unobstructed. But small complaints, or maybe just ways that I'd redo it rather than an actual gripe, I suppose. Here we have our Gravity Group wooden coaster with a fairly nice layout, I think, similar to one that I had done earlier in some other builds, but I think it works fairly nicely here with the twisted sections and drops underneath and around the lift and all these different crossovers and everything. This bit of a tunnel section right here. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, and it seems like the guests are a big fan of it too, as folks are lining up for it. There's our top spin there, nicely aligned with the drop over here. And I do like how we obscured the building in the end. It's, similar to, I guess other RCT1 style builds, but I think it's a decent blend of trying to add some interaction to it with these pathways and the fences and the sunk shops and stalls inside of it. Works okay. Could have maybe done a little bit more, but in the end I think it's okay. Our plazas here with the big Intamin drop tower here, all working around our reworked version of Grapevine, which puts it more in line with Chang or what became Green Lantern. I really did like this ride. I think it worked fairly well. Certainly the original is such a classic and was one of my favorite attractions back in the day, but this makes it a lot more realistic, and I'm pretty happy with the overall layout too. I like the way that the turn here sort of works with the loop. I just realized I have not been showing the stats and everything. That's the car ride, which you guys probably are not interested in. Grapevine stats are very high, extreme, and high, and the extreme comes from this guy right here, this turn. If you extend it out a little bit, it makes it better, but in the end I don't really care, so I think we're all right there. For the wooden coaster, we are high, very high, medium. Not totally surprising. We've got a lot of diving and climbing small corners here, so not surprising whatsoever. For the boomerang, we are high, high, medium. And then for the shuttle loop, we are high, medium, low. And then finally, our last little coaster over here is our junior inverter coaster, which is medium across the board. I think that fits fairly well. So this is our B&M Junior Inverter Coaster, and I'm pretty happy with this overall layout. I think it works very nicely. It's got this kind of cool figure 8 here, this final helix that gives you some speed, and then even a little bit of a tunnel with this climb up into the brakes. And I feel like it works very well for a junior coaster, and we can run our 2 trains, and in general, it's just, I like it. I think it worked out fairly well. Funtopia was one of these parks that I was always fairly excited to get to, just because it was such a classic one for me back in the day, and I just kind of liked the vibe of the whole thing. So I was excited to build this one, and I'm pretty happy with the result. Next up is Haunted Harbor, which I'm even more excited for because it's, again, such a classic scenario, and it has a lot of opportunity to do some cool stuff. And spoiler alert, I think that one turned out really, really nice, and maybe my favorite scenario that I built in this entire series so far, so stuff to look forward to. As always, thank you guys very much for your reactions and comments and likes and follows and all of those sorts of things. If you'd like to do more of that, twitch.tv/Amusement Academy. We're also on Discord, and you can find those links below. I've got merchandise if you're interested in a t-shirt with a stupid phrase on it, and all of those sorts of things are for you to discover if you wish. But even just watching it is enough, and hearing your thoughts and comments are great too. So very much appreciate it as always, and we will catch you in the next one. So here's some before and after, and enjoy. Bye now.